the painter can't do anything until they've chosen their canvas. You know, you have to choose a place, I think, and then you have to give yourself to that place as it is. We are trying to figure out a way to qualitatively evaluate success.
Yeah.
And it's very hard.
Measuring that is a part of just being in it with people. You have to have conversations, hear about people's lives, watch them, they know you, vice versa, to be able to measure that. Welcome to Parish, a video podcast that celebrates, equips, and focuses on small churches and why they matter so much. We believe small churches are uniquely positioned to integrate in their communities and engage issues in ways only small churches can. I'm your host, Canaan Hurst, and this is episode 9, Neighborhood, Taking Spiritual and Social Responsibility, Part 2. In this episode, we pick up right where we left off with Nathan Hoag. If you haven't had a chance to listen to episode 8, I'd highly encourage you to listen to that before moving on to the second half of this interview. You have been doing this for 6 years at our church, at a parish, kind of geographically focused church, which in the grand scheme of history or historical precedent for staying at a church is not that long, but recent history is like the average is like 4 years.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Is that for like lead pastors or?
Honestly, I don't know.
Wow. I did not know that.
I saw that somewhere. It kind of doesn't surprise me.
No, I mean, it correlates exactly with that burnout thing I was talking about earlier. Like you just, a lot of times for a lot of people, the assumption is like, well, if I can just change pace or change jobs, that will be a change of pace too. When in reality, most of the times we make either, this is for every industry, we either make lateral moves or we try to get like kind of promoted sort of moves,
right,
which will not change the pace of your life.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No.
Like by definition, they will not.
Absolutely. I mean, you plan on never leaving Inglewood.
Nah, bury me under the house, man.
There you go. So what is like consistency, longevity? What are the benefits you've already seen from that? Because again, you're already over the average. And what are you looking forward to with the consistency and just being here through thick and thin?
It has slowed me down significantly. So I think you develop a really rushed pace when you feel like you've got to cram, sort of a lifetime's worth of work into 4 years or whatever, the average is. But when you think like I could basically do this till I, retire, or I don't even know what retirement is going to look like for me. I'll probably never retire, but like, you know what I mean? Like when at some point I'll pass the baton on to someone else to lead this thing. Ideally, like before I'm really old. Like I'd actually like to not get to a point where everyone's like, please leave, that would be nice. But I'm looking at decades essentially of work that I can continue to do in this city. And it just takes the pressure off. Like I mean, we could easily spend 2 years walking around and praying and just like paying attention and just saying like, what is God already up to here? Because there was just no rush. Like there was just no like fire in my belly to like get it all done in a short period of time. It was like, no, I want to do the slow, like paced version of this. And I get caught up in hurry all the time. So like, I'm not saying it's like fixed it, but it has provided an ecosystem and environment where hurry is much easier to stave off. Mm-hmm. Because I just don't feel like I have to cram everything into this like really short career.
Yeah. And again,
range.
The church in the first 3 or 4 centuries it was about being the patient presence,
yep,
the unhurried presence, and still it grew. Mm-hmm. It expanded
kind of against all odds. I mean, like you look at the model, and you, I think you're working through it now, but the book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, the model is so opposite of a church growth model that we oftentimes subscribe to today. It is so opposite of the way we think of like modern day, the institution of the modern day, evangelical church, that like, you're just like, how How did you even survive? And churches actually started to go through tremendous struggle and even experience like kind of decline when it became the national religion, like, you know, 330 or whatever. Constantine goes, oh, this Christianity thing is pretty cool. Everyone's a Christian. We're all doing this now. Sort of state-sponsored Christianity.
Right.
And that was actually, like, it kind of marks the beginning of some major struggles in the church that many of which have not really been resolved, you know. And I think in the U.S., where we have just this, at least this sensibility that Christianity is kind of our national religion, even though that statistically that's wildly untrue.
Historically, it's
Historically
untrue.
even, yeah. But we think of it that way a lot of times. It just seems so normal to us and standard to us. And we experience tremendous difficulty. It's actually when the church has been like sort of subversively, you know, underground and kind of going at this like slow chipping away pace and thinking of growth in terms of generations, hundreds of years. Like we just have a completely different yardstick in the way that we think of things in the modern era. You know, we think of things in like, you know, we need to grow X amount within the next year or next month or something like that. It's like that metric isn't going to work, you know, for at least the way that we're trying to do it.
Right.
That's just a recipe for me, at least, and for our church. I think it's a recipe for burnout. So,
yeah, it's like how much of our practices and rhythms displaying the character and the love of God to anyone who's watching.
Which the character and love of God, the more and the more that I come to understand it is. It's gentle and it's patient and it's not hyped up and in your face. It's a beautiful, you know, relationship between a parent and a child, and it's peaceful. And so, like, if we are representatives of that characteristic and of that love, then we've got to figure out how to slow it down.
Yeah,
because being rushed and being hyped and being charismatic, you know, and I mean in the kind of personality trait sense, is none of those are fruits of the Spirit. Jesus doesn't mention any of those things in the Beatitudes.
In fact, hype, I mean, churches that are built around hype, I've not heard of one that has risen in the recent past, that has risen to a certain level, except maybe a select few. But even those that I can think of were never actually really hyped. The ones that have been hyped in the last 10, 20 years have, I mean, who's left that hasn't kind of experienced some sort of major life-changing breakdown of leadership?
Scandal, burnout, you know, like a psychotic break kind of from like reality. Like there's all these things that tend to happen because you just a church where like hype and energy is sort of the lay of the land, are just like meat grinders, you know, like you just show up to those in leadership and it's just like, I don't know, that's just not sustainable. Yeah. You know, for the average person, I think there are the occasional few out there, there are anomalies out there, absolutely, who like, no, they can run at that pace for decades and like they'll be okay. The biggest problem that those folks have and that those churches have is who the heck is your predecessor? Yeah. Or who's your successor? Yeah. Like how in the world do you find, because that person's a unicorn, like whoever can run at that pace and grind it out like that, they're impossible to find, right? And so like somehow you have to like find, mentor, build a relationship with, and then like pass the baton onto this person who has the exact same pacing as you do. And it's just not going to happen. It's not a sustainable model.
And when hype and energy are or at least when churches are trying to make hype and energy maybe the most recognizable thing about their church, it's when inevitably sin comes to light. Because I mean, to be clear, like you're gonna deal with sin as much as any hyped up pastor. Yeah. But
I
the difference
I do all the
is,
time. I mean, I'm a human being.
like a sinner.
Yeah.
But in those kind of situations where literally you can't know the person at the top because there are just too many people, there's too much bureaucracy, there are too many kind of boundaries to be able to be close to a person who's leading such a large movement, so to speak. When these things come out, they're usually a huge surprise. And what comes with that is complete disorientation on the part of everybody. It is like,
because I kind of like, usually in that case, I, as the like churchgoer, sort of have 90% of my faith and maybe even my worldview in general is attached to this person, whether I realize it or not. And I'm not like, some people have like been like, this is idolatry, like, whatever. I don't think anybody's really doing this like cognitively or like, consciously. Right? It's not like I'm choosing like, oh, that my pastor is like the God that I worship.
Right.
But you develop that relationship of like, I've really kind of hung my hat on this one person and their sort of faith. And so when their life crumbles or their life takes a turn or they struggle through something, my life will inevitably follow that exact same path because I'm so attached to them. And that's just a kind of an unhealthy sort of codependency that I think a lot of people develop with their pastors or their leadership or whatever that they aren't even really aware of until the rug's pulled out from under them. And then it's like, oh my gosh, this was just a house of cards the whole time. And now it's just crumbling.
Right. Which, like, something that I've seen you in a continual attempt to avoid that kind of level of responsibility and I mean, you have that responsibility too, but your responsibility is to be honest with people. One thing that I've seen that you do to combat this is have as much of a plurality of leadership as possible. That is other staff, which there aren't that many,
right,
and volunteers, people who aren't just completely reliant on you to make a thing happen.
Yeah, I don't want to be the bottleneck for anybody's spirituality or spiritual growth or spiritual health or connection to Jesus or whatever. Like in the same way, I don't want to be, I don't want to be the bottleneck for my kids' educational pursuits or athletic pursuits or social pursuits. Like I want to get out of the way as people become more and more, mature and able and that kind of thing. And so you have to I think you have to create an environment where it is normal for the guy who's in charge to not have a microphone or whatever. I mean, this microphone is how in the modern era we demonstrate power, right? So like who gets this thing is the person who gets power. Whether it's in an interview on a podcast or on a stage on a Sunday morning at a church gathering, or somebody's making a film and they've got a microphone that's off camera that's on that person, and that person's they've got power at that moment. We use microphones, and so we thought through kind of at the beginning, like how do we make sure that we spread out who has a microphone. Literally, that was like the goal. I mean, you probably remember some of these conversations. Yeah. It was like, we have to be very careful. I mean, you and I have a lot of things in common. We have a lot of things that are very similar. And so when you and I were leading the church at the beginning, we had to be very careful not to be the only ones leading everything or the only ones with a microphone, because that becomes a very homogenous echo chamber style of leadership that we wanted to avoid.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of intentionality, because the natural way to do it, the way you do it without being intentional, essentially gravitates towards that like homogeneity,
all that boils down to trust your people. I mean, it's easy. I'm sure you've been tempted in a lot of situations to just want to control it so that you know it's going to be how you want it.
Yeah,
to
it's
be.
A lot of risk in just saying like, oh, you're in charge now. Like you can run this. Here's a microphone.
Right.
Go nuts.
Yeah, exactly. For a lot of reasons, it's risky just to trust anything to anyone. Not to mention, you're going to bear the brunt of the responsibility for what other people do
all the time. All the time, man. Yeah, and like I think that changes. That can change over time. That slowly, I think slowly our church is kind of seeing like, there's actually a plurality, not just in leadership, but also in responsibility. And so like people are seeing like different ways to sort of apply their, questions or challenges or whatever. But yeah, like, especially in the beginning, I mean, it was like, at the end of the day, it would all fall on me. And so there was huge kind of personal risk in that, but I'm really great. Like looking back, it was worth it because we've developed a high risk tolerance as a community. When a guest gets up on stage or a person we don't recognize, the suspicion is not our immediate posture.
Right. It's like, oh yeah, I've seen this before.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Like this feels normal. This feels like, oh cool. Like I wonder what they've got to say, and we've developed that's in our DNA and our culture now. And I don't have to keep like cultivating it and pushing it. It's happening naturally now.
Yeah.
Which is really neat to have turned that corner.
Yeah. Let's talk about, with people who are leading small churches, a part of small churches.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked on a theoretical level a lot. We talked about a lot of successes. What are some of the greatest hardships you have experienced in 6 years, you continue to experience, maybe you see on the horizon?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are the hardest things about living a parish model?
One of the really hard things is I think that the way to do this, again, isn't to rush in and try to create a bunch of change, but first to accept things as they are. And there are a lot of things about our community that are really, really difficult. There are heartbreaking things like poverty, homelessness, crime, that kind of thing that just hurt, to know about and engage. And then there are also a lot of like really just like frustrating, kind of inconvenient things. I mean, we'll go visit a friend who lives like way outside of town. They've got a couple acres, they've got like, big house and, basically like a trampoline and a swing set and whatever, like, and like my kids, I'm like watching my kids have like the absolute time of their life. And I'm like, is that actually better? I mean, I don't know, because I'm like, I live on my lot, my lot, where my house is 6,000 square feet. Okay. I have a classic city lot, right? Very small yard. We are on the corner of two very busy streets, and we're only like 2 blocks off of Broadway, which is like, a very busy street
in our city.
Yeah, it's like the main kind of way to get anywhere. And then we're a block off of Dartmouth, which is also like a main vein to get anywhere. So navigating our neighborhood for our kids is not easy or safe or convenient or whatever. And in some ways I'm like really grateful because they've learned things at a very early age that I think are going to be really helpful if they like move to New York City someday or move to a really highly populated area. They're going to know how to navigate a city.
Yeah.
They've learned how to measure distances in city blocks. And I love that. I think that's really cool. And it's also been wildly inconvenient compared to my friends who can just say like, yeah, we live in the countryside. Like nothing bad ever happens here. We can just send our kids out unsupervised,
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds amazing. So like some of the challenge that we've experienced over the years is being patient. And it's not even being patient because patience sort of assumes and anticipates change. It's more like acceptance, like accepting like this is how our neighborhood is. And it's that some of those elements will never change. That's just been like hard for us at times, like we've had plenty of things stolen from our house, like, people broken in, our neighbors' cars have been stolen. They've been broken into, crime is high in our area. And I'm grateful that it's mostly like kind of property related crime and assault is low essentially. But like I've woken up to gunshots in my neighborhood and I've gone out and found, shell casings and bullet holes and things. And I mean, like at some point I guess you just have to like accept that that's the reality. Now, do I also want to change those things? Do I want my neighborhood to be a less violent place? Absolutely. And I have this theory that as the church continues to be more engaged and continues to be a more peaceful presence in our neighborhood, there will be change, but it'll probably be a really long time. And in the meantime, I'm raising young kids in an area where there's occasional active shooters. And sometimes that feels like failure, like on my part. It feels like I'm failing my kids for bringing them into a neighborhood where it's less safe than where they were.
Yeah.
And sometimes it also feels more like a failure from a pastor standpoint, because I'm like, our church should have changed this by now. Like, what kind of, there's that rushed, hurried sense of me that's like, what kind of church are we if we haven't like quelled gun violence in our neighborhood? Shouldn't we have solved that by now?
Right.
And that's just that impatience in me, and sometimes the lack of acceptance, maybe denial, to like, this is the reality we live in currently.
And you realize, you're someone who realizes there's a really good book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.
It's about racial discrimination in real estate, right?
Real estate practices, covenants that white communities would use to keep out black potential home buyers. Anyway, but they talk a lot about white flight.
Yeah.
The flight from neighborhoods of people who can afford it.
Yeah.
And
like as white guys, like this is like under the radar to us. Like, we don't even know. Like, I needed a book to tell me that this was happening and has been happening.
Exactly.
Right. So it's like fascinating to like wake up to that and be like, oh my gosh. I just wanted to kind of clarify. I think that anybody who's watching or listening, there are these kind of seminal pieces of work that are so necessary for us to wake up to, like, this is happening right next door to me, and I've just been unaware of it.
Right.
So anyway, keep going.
And now, if we know anything from statistics and research having to do with violent neighborhoods, that there are two things in response to violence, or in response to homogenous and low income neighborhood that are wrong. There are probably more than two responses that are wrong. One of the biggest ones is leaving.
Yep.
When folks who are committed to patience, love, again, there are extenuating circumstances. Maybe a family does need to leave, but when it's a mass exodus of people who are worried about violence or what could happen, that is a response out of fear.
Yeah.
And then leaving, the people who can afford, and it's only the people who can afford to leave.
Because leaving is very expensive, and you're usually going to a more expensive place.
You usually are. You usually can only do that because you own property,
right,
or have some sort of social capital. So any response, I think any church goer or pastor will have to admit that any response based in fear is not the right response.
Right. But very tempting.
But very extremely tempting, of course. Yeah. And then, we have conversations on other episodes of this podcast that have to do with gentrification. The idea of moving into a place because it's, got people who don't look like you.
Yeah.
Just for the sake of being in a different place. Has forced a lot of people out because it's made,
because I can move in and I can start to make the place look more like me.
Yeah, exactly.
Or like function more like where my preferences are.
A lot of people don't even think they're going to do that. Oh no, I'm moving to this place because there are a lot of people who look like me, but who don't look like me.
It's kind of unintentional.
So it's going to be awesome for me because I'm going to be able to say, look, my neighborhood doesn't look like me. Well, the truth is, there's a lot more financial opportunity when more people like you get there. So leaving a community because of fear, or going in when you have the ability and say, oh my gosh, houses are so cheap here.
Yeah.
Like we know that either of those responses to a place that is violent or that has lots of issues, either the disinvestment or the displacement of people are not the right things to do.
Yeah. Which like piques my interest to like, well, what's that third way, or what's that other way that like, that is right, that does actually continue to empower and bring equity. And I don't know that we've like solved that by any means, but I do think that one piece of that, of finding the right, the right way or the most honorable way to do this is choosing to stay and preserve that which is, either good or doesn't have like a moral value to it. It's just like, it is.
Yeah.
Like, this is the way it is. and then like work to change and make progress in the areas that truly are causing harm, you know?
Yeah.
So like, um, I mean, I could think of some examples if you want to go there, but I think that's the main thing that we're trying to navigate right now. And that's like real time. Like I don't have like nice packaged answers to this question that I'm posing, which is, you know, how do you engage a neighborhood over the course of a long period of time that delineates between the things that really do need to change because they're causing harm and the things that I'd like to change because they would make my life more convenient.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of things where I'm like, gosh, that would be just more convenient. It would just be tidier if things were this way. Those are not necessarily things that deserve my attention because they're not an issue of harm caused.
Yeah.
And so that's the process my family and I are in right now. And I don't have like a nice answer for that. I'm just trying to figure it out.
That's not to say that if you feel God calling you to a neighborhood that even if it is a place that doesn't look like you, I mean, of course, he will open doors and opportunities for you to do that. You have a perfect you're a perfect example of that, where you prayed for a lot of months and just your wife like ran at someone who was outside of their house.
Yeah.
Said, "We want your house. It's so close to our church." And they basically were like, "Okay."
They're like, fine, sure. Yeah.
And that, that doesn't happen for everyone, but
yeah, I would say it's an outlier.
Yeah, exactly.
Scenario.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. But you knew that this is where you were called to. You were praying for it. Didn't happen immediately.
Yeah.
And God opened a door for you.
Yeah.
And it's not like Inglewood's kind of a wacky, weird city. It's still, it has a lot more like socioeconomic diversity than it does racial diversity. Typically or historically blue collar neighborhood, but those are all things that you learned slowly just being here.
Yeah. You figure out, you can only learn so much about a place on a website. So like you read the demographics of Inglewood and you're like, oh, it's predominantly white. And then you show up to like my kid's school, for instance, and you're like, but this school is predominantly not white. Like, how does that work out? And you start to learn about this particular pocket, this particular neighborhood is less white than, the rest of the city. And then you learn things like you learn about white flight and how much that's happened in our schools. And so you've got a lot of people who live in our community who might normally be districted to go to our school, but they don't go to that school because they have the means and the resources to get their kid out to a different school. And that's what's caused that switch from a predominantly white city to predominantly non-white schools. That's kind of what happens in a community like ours. But you don't learn any of that stuff from reading a website. Like, you just can't. You have to kind of like be in the mix, and you have to ask questions, and you have to kind of come to understand it from the inside. So, you have to choose a place, I think, and then you have to give yourself to that place as it is. This goes back to those relationships that we were talking about with city officials or whatever. Like, you choose that person as they are. And there's so much of like the way I see so many parallels between the way that like Jesus has interacted with humanity in this, because there wasn't like, we've kind of gotten it backwards. I think sometimes like he wasn't like, well, here are all the things you have to do in order to come and be, one of my friends or my disciples or whatever. It was like, I actually love you as you are, and change will come along the way, but it's going to happen as we go. Like, we're going to keep going, and you're going to keep following me, and we're going to keep doing this together. There aren't a ton of prerequisites. And similarly, I've tried to approach our city the same way and go like, okay, I don't need this city to be a certain way in order for me to love her. I will love her, and along the way, we will make the changes necessary, but we will do that together. So one of the things we say regularly is that we're a church in, for, and with the city of Inglewood. So in, that's our location. For, that's our motivation. Like, we are for the city, and we want to do things that benefit the city. But we're also with the city. So that's kind of like our posture or orientation. We do it with shoulder to shoulder with the people that are here, not like against or against superior to, right? We didn't come in with all the answers. I hear a lot of church planners talk like, and this is a great fundraising strategy, and it's also just like terribly unfair to your actual neighbors. people will talk about, well, this place we're moving to, like it's just this kind of godless, pagan, wasteland, and like we're going to be the light in this dark place, and we're going to bring Jesus to these people, and we're essentially like, if it isn't for us, these people will perish. Like not that parish, the other kind, like something horrible is going to happen to them. Like it's this hellscape. Yeah. And like, if it wasn't for us, and imagine being a person who lives in the neighborhood that you are planting a church in, and you stumble across a website that describes you that way.
Yeah.
Like you're going like, what? I don't want anything to do with these people. Like they think I'm just like in this abysmal, like lonely, like anxious, just, totally isolated. My life is unhealthy, and they're going to come and like, rescue me? Thanks a lot. No, thanks. Actually, I want nothing to do with that. And, versus a posture of like, no, we're actually just going to navigate this together with you. Like, something bad happens in the community, we're just going to be there with you to kind of like weep alongside you and just be sad with you. Not to rush and fix and be the Messiah in the community, whatever. Like, we're just going to be there with you. And hey, when something great happens, we're going to celebrate with you too. We're not going to take credit for it. We're just going to like celebrate with you because we're doing this shoulder to shoulder. That's a key piece, I think, of like that long, patient, non-hurried parish mentality where it's not broad, but it's also not shallow. It's narrow and it's deep. Like the roots are just going deeper and deeper rather than going farther and farther out.
And that's success in your eyes, right? Is deep roots.
Yeah. Which is hard to measure. I mean, to be fair, like I think,
right.
Like, yes. And also it's really hard to evaluate that kind of, I mean, the easiest way to measure anything, especially in this line of work, is quantitatively, right? Like, how much of that thing do we have? How many people? How much money? How many square feet? Whatever, like, right? We are trying to figure out a way to qualitatively evaluate success.
Yeah.
And it's very hard.
It's really hard. It's not clear. I mean, that's a result of the church modeling itself after corporate models is corporations rely on clear, concise, very specific information.
Yeah. Qualitative data. Yeah. Or quantitative data. Yeah.
Quantitative, yeah. And a qualitative approach has to do with formation and integration. And that measuring that is a part of just being in it with people. You have to have conversations, hear about people's lives, watch them, they know you, vice versa, to be able to measure that. And if you're focused on counting how many people, the information and the reach might look like a huge lake, but it's like about 2 inches deep.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because you can't really tell like what's under the surface, and so we're trying to figure out how to measure, and not even to measure it just so that we know, but it's more like to pursue, like I'm trying to pursue the depth of spiritual presence in a neighborhood. And I don't feel like I have a lot of good models for it either. And so like, I feel like, and I, I mean, you've known me long enough to know, like, I actually really like this kind of frontline work where you're just like, doing something that doesn't feel like it's like pioneering new ground kind of. It isn't to say nobody else is doing this. That's not at all what I mean. I just mean that there aren't a lot of models for it. I mean, we've had this conversation about small church a million times. Like there aren't a lot of good models for how to do healthy small church because they don't dominate the airwaves. They don't dominate the news cycles. Like there aren't resources made by and for people in small churches. And so there aren't a lot of models for that. And so anyway, I similarly, when it comes to Parish, I feel like we're stepping into sort of like an unknown territory, at least in this era. Like I said, it's not an original idea. We're dusting off an old one, but we don't have a lot of models for it in this modern era, and so we're kind of trying to figure out like, how do we do this? How do we do it well? How do we evaluate it and measure it? And then how do we reproduce it ideally? Because that's a question I have in my mind looming. It's like, I love what's happened here. I'm so grateful for it. I never want to leave it. But how do I help it happen and empower it other places? Because I think it could happen there, and it could be really beneficial for the people there, and it could be a gift.
Yeah.
I'm not the guy to do it because I'm not leaving, but like,
Yeah.
who is it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, who's the person who's going to maybe do this somewhere else? I don't know. I want to find that out.
Yeah. And to just briefly go back before we wrap up, talking about justice issues in your community, the only reason you know the specific ones is because you've restricted you've restricted kind of your view in terms of like, I'm not going to look past this boundary because I can't remember, 5 miles away, all of the things or even know about them as well as I can know about these issues and these things really like in my backyard.
And it's not to say that those things that are happening over there are unimportant.
Right.
But they can't be my responsibility because there's enough to do. There's actually more than I can do right here in my backyard. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you start to, I've heard someone describe Parish thinking from like a painter's perspective. At some point, you have to pick your canvas. Now, there's a tremendous freedom in the limitation. Once you get the canvas, it's like, well, I can do anything on that, right? I can use any kind of paint. I can use any kind of medium, right? Like I've seen people use, like whatever, like newspaper or like, something 3-dimensional or like whatever you want to use on that canvas, but you've chosen a canvas, which means you've chosen limits. And once you've chosen those limits, you have all kinds of freedom within that. And it's actually less daunting than for there to be like no limitations. The painter can't do anything until they've chosen their canvas, right? Mm-hmm. Similarly, I can't really do anything of substance until I've chosen like the place in which I'm going to do it. That isn't to, say like people who are trying to work on things like on a national or global level or whatever, like they're not making a difference. I don't think that at all. Some of this is just my personal experience, but like I realized that like when I can get down to issues of justice and equity in my neighborhood, I can make a real impact, like a visible impact, really, really fast. I can show up to a school board meeting and say, this is an issue of inequity in the like whatever 8 schools that are in my district. It's a small district, and I can say, we can work on this one thing for the students in our school system that are experiencing inequity and discrimination, and we can make an impact for my literal neighbors within the course of a year. Yeah. What other justice issue do you know of where you could actually change the landscape for a person that you actually know in the course of a year or less? Right? It accelerates everything. It's this. It's like a pressure cooker. Right. You choose this area and then you dive into the issues that are present there, and like you can make real, lasting, visible, apparent change in that place. It's amazing.
Right. So, what are some of the rhythms that you have implemented at your church, weekly, monthly, yearly, that help shape people to notice the problems in our community, celebrate the good things in our community? I mean, just as important that we don't focus on, right? Yeah. And integrate for the sake of being Jesus' hands and feet in the community. What are the kind of rhythms that you've chosen?
So one thing that became really important in developing these rhythms is finding out kind of where in the city, kind of like the rails on which resources travel. Okay. So like every city, every neighborhood, every community has something, some currency, some resource, something, right? And figuring out like how those resources move around and go from person to person, or how maybe they're sort of like hoarded and centralized around one person or one entity or whatever, is also a really important part of that. That allows you to start to narrow down like, well, what are the ways that we can get involved in the things that are already here? So one of the sort of like theories we've used along the way is God has already been at work in the community that you're in. You have this incredible privilege and invitation to join God in that work. Rather than like starting the new thing, like God's already doing it. Like, where is it? Find out and pay attention. Step into it. So for us, we've identified 4 pathways or rail lines or whatever you want to call it, where resource and currency or whatever are sort of like navigated in our city. So that's the schools, our government, businesses, and then our literal neighbors, the people who live, whether it's on a car in a car in my street, in a tent in my alley, or in a house next door to me, an apartment above me, that kind of thing. Those are kind of the 4 avenues or pathways that we've seen, like resource, currency, power, and their opposites circulate in our city, right? And so then what we've done is developed rhythms within each of those, right? And for everybody, whenever they're like, well, I want to jump into like, okay, government, that's really cool. Our church is involved in our city government. They, when people from our church show up and they say something to city council or whatever, like, it's like talking to an old friend, that's kind of the way the dialogue goes. But at first, because people are eager, they want to jump in. Like, what's the program? What's the rhythm? Whatever. The first thing we always ask them to do is just show up for a while and just pay attention. Because what happens is you start to notice the things, the cracks, physical, literal and figurative. You notice kind of the cracks in the system, and then you can step in and develop your own rhythm, or you can borrow a rhythm that we've created. We definitely do that sometimes too. I'll give you an example. We, our city has I believe a higher than normal or higher than average population of people who need ADA accommodations.
Sidewalks.
Absolutely. Sidewalks, transportation, whatever. Like they
entry to buildings. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And that has a lot to do with the hospital that my wife works at, which is Craig Hospital. It's a hospital that works with, it's a rehabilitation hospital for people with brain and spinal cord injuries. And so they have this like really long-term rehabilitation process. They own a bunch of the apartments around the hospital. And when you were released from the hospital, you usually graduate to having your own place right next to the hospital where you can get all your outpatient treatment. And oftentimes we'll be walking around the city and there are nurses out with their patient, and their patient is relearning how to engage their community from a wheelchair because they have not done that ever in their life, right? That's important to our community. Our community needs to be ADA compliant in order to care for our neighbors, our physical, literal neighbors who live in our community. There's a sidewalk in our neighborhood that, for whatever reason, for all this time, 3 of the 4 corners were not ramps. They were just like that, like the curb, right?
Yeah.
And I discovered it because my kids were really, really little, and we would walk to the park. It was the only way to get to the park from my house, and they just kept they would just ride their scooters or whatever, tricycles straight off the edge of that thing. And we bloodied enough chins over the years where I was like, something's got to change.
Yeah.
Because all I could think about was like, if it's really tough for my 2-year-old or my 3-year-old, imagine somebody who's having to navigate this in like a wheelchair, and maybe it's the first time they're using a wheelchair, that kind of thing. Not in my neighborhood, right? So we got pretty adamant about it. And we used like the app that Inglewood uses, and we showed up to city council meetings, and we talked to neighbors and whatever, and we just kind of made a big fuss about it in as respectful way as we possibly could. And I was walking home from the train station one day, and I noticed there was like some, I don't know, like they had done something, there was dust everywhere or whatever. And I look over, and there's like some plastic or whatever covering up these corners. And I was like, I wonder, and I peeked under one, and it was like this beautiful ramp, and I was like, yes, we did it, like this is it. But that's the kind of thing that you don't really notice unless you're walking a lot of places. It's not the kind of thing you care about if you're not in a wheelchair, or if you don't know about Craig Hospital, for instance. Like the spiritual practice of paying attention is the primary gateway to developing rhythms and practices that are actually engaging the people in those, 4 entities that I mentioned, right? If you're not volunteering in the neighborhood, the school that's in your neighborhood, you're never going to know what the needs for that school is. And yet that is a primary place where we think that God is at work, is in our school system. So what are you going to do? How are you going to find out? You're not going to find out from a website. You know, you're going to find out by being in the school. So when people are like, I want to be involved in that school pathway, like I want to do that. You know, my wife was one of those people. And eventually I was like, you should, you know, or not me, but like people were like, hey, you should join this one board, this curriculum board. And she got in on that and she became the chair of that board. And then they were like, hey, you should run for school board. And she ran for school board and she won. And she's on the school board now. Yeah, she just like landslide victory, right? And she's been, in many cases, like the voice of reason, I feel like, on that board. It's been amazing. She's had an incredible way to serve there. But she didn't get there because one day she woke up and she was like, I want to be in charge. My wife doesn't want to be in charge of anything, actually.
Yeah.
But she got in on the ground level and started to see the need and the need and the need and thought, I have a voice, I have resources, I have something to give. And she developed a practice around that.
Right. And in a democracy, you can be elected to a place to make decisions. You know, a lot of people will steer away from that because they think, well, the early church, well, there wasn't a, you know, you couldn't get voted into.
Yeah, that didn't exist.
Like, why not use all the tools at our disposal? And you bring up schools, which is huge. Oh, I think people who don't have kids, me, lots of people even who do have kids are like, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't even know how to fix educational issues. It's not even just about that. One of the best things we do yearly rhythm is the Inglewood Christmas Store, which started at the elementary school and lots of others were able to convince the city council not to move.
Yeah.
Only because there was a big church, thank God, that had actually started
way outside of town. We were their like urban ministry. We were like, there's a lot of people in Inglewood who are struggling and impoverished, and like we're gonna go and serve them. And that was like their thing. They came and started this store,
an affordable Christmas present store, and which was so huge. But you wouldn't have known about that if you didn't know the principal of that school.
I didn't have any kids in Bishop when we first started engaging it. We had young kids, but they weren't of school age yet. And I knocked on the door of the school one day, and this isn't when it was in its old building, but it's the same location, different principal than it is now. And you know, the administrator of the school, she was like, "Can I help you? Like, is there something you need? Do you have a student here?" You know, I was like, "I don't have a student here. I really want to meet with the principal." And she was like, well, why? Again, it was suspicion. Immediately met with suspicion. And I was like, I'm a pastor in the area. Like, I just kind of want to get to know, like, what is already happening here that we can jump into? What can we get behind? I met with the principal. I think it was a couple of days later because they were like, she's busy, you know. And she was like, well, there's this Christmas store that this big church has been doing. And like, I think it'd be really cool if like a local church was involved in it because you know our people and that kind of thing. And I was like, okay, cool. Let's check it out. And like, that was our first year. So, you know, 6-7 years ago, I think we're going on our 7th store, but this year, it'll be the 10th year that the store has been taking place. And I think at that time it served like, I don't know, like maybe 30 families at Bishop at that one school. Now we've expanded it to serve 4 schools in our district. And we're going to serve probably over 200 families this year. Like 1,000 kids or like 800 kids or something crazy like that. And it's astronomically bigger than we are, but every year we took over more of it and that other church backed out a little more. And now that church isn't involved. Actually, they run the same thing in their community. Yeah. So they become more locally focused on the way they do it. And we've kind of taken this thing over and I don't think we would have gotten there if we hadn't started to show up to town hall meetings, knocking on the door of the principal's office. Not even having kids in the school, but just showing up and saying, we want to be a safe, helpful presence. What does that mean? And let them dictate the terms. Mm-hmm. And that's how it all progressed. And like now
and this
it's
big
like
church that, again, we got to inherit an infrastructure of this thing.
Yes. That they put together.
That they put together thanks to them. But they were totally cool. I mean, after that first year, we partnered with them and just watched it and participated with them. Mm-hmm. You met with one of their pastors and was like, I want to be in charge of this.
I want this.
Yeah.
I need you to give it to me.
And they were like, cool.
They were like, great. Yeah, we actually we like that idea too. We don't think you should take it all right now, which was wise. We think you should take it little at a time. And I was like, okay, I can get on board with that. So again, that patient kind of slow chipping away. Mm-hmm. And this is the first year that the Inglewood Christmas Store, which is now the Inglewood Christmas Store, not the Bishop Christmas Store, this is the first year that we've been fully in charge of it.
Yeah.
And it just watching that progress has been so amazing, but it's been slow, and it has been all along the way. What do the schools and the families in the schools actually need? Yeah. Which is one of the ways we've expanded outside of just like Christmas gifts. Like Christmas gifts are great, but like a lot of these families need like warm outerwear to get through the winter. They need groceries, that kind of thing. So now it's like, yeah, we do the present thing. That's really cool. But now we also have an outerwear store where they come and like for free, they just were able to get like outerwear and then they get a week's worth of groceries. And like we've expanded it to meet the real needs of the community. And the reason why we know what those needs are is because we're integrated into it.
And we don't have the money to provide everything. So other local churches have come alongside to provide groceries.
Yeah.
Like it is a extremely beautiful team effort,
all hands on deck.
Yeah.
Because there's no way we could run this thing on our own. We're too small.
Multi-denominational, cross all sorts of boundaries to come together to care for the city. Which
it's a to me a beautiful kind of outworking of this. Like you start with the question and you start with the presence. I'm going to continue to be a peaceful presence in this area.
Yeah.
And I'm going to continue to listen and pay attention. And it may never grow. I mean, the Christmas story is like, it's a really fun story to tell. And it's also like, I want to be really clear that it in some ways is kind of an anomaly, and it is not necessarily a marker of success just because it's grown so much. If anything, it's an indication of the need. Mm-hmm. If anything, the reason why it's grown is because we're realizing more and more that the need is actually bigger than we ever thought.
And it's freaking hard. Like it's a year long.
It's exhausting.
It's a year-long effort.
We run it in December. Our first meeting to start planning for that year is in January.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's massive effort. But again, it all started with like showing up and being present, and that's where you start to gain. So like that's kind of the prerequisite for anybody in church who's like, I want to get involved and like jump in. Cool. So here's the thing that's already happening. Start showing up to it and just paying attention. And like maybe a year in, we'll work out some kind of a practice or a rhythm around that.
Right.
But you got to show up for a while first.
And then, and I'm extending this longer than I should, but one of my favorite rhythms, and that something that we never would have thought of, again, gosh, another example of just knowing people in the community is Thankful Thursday, we call it. And it wasn't Nathan's idea. It wasn't my idea. It wasn't anyone except a local bar owner who happened to be starting his bar like a month before we did.
We have like almost the same birthday. Yeah.
Right. He
our
had
church
grown
and
up,
his bar. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
He'd grown up in Inglewood. He had been a bartender all over the Denver Metro and was like, I want to go back to Inglewood. I want to invest, and he's not a believer, but he was like, I believe in the well-being of our city. So we started.
There's a lot of overlap in like the way we think and the way they think.
Yeah.
And that overlap has allowed us to like work together in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Another great example of like, then they had this idea and we were like, oh, we just want to jump into that idea.
Yeah. And we knew.
And maybe put some
right
more resources into it or whatever.
He had started, basically said, hey, come on Thursdays. I'll provide cards and stationery. You write a thank you note to someone you care about, just for whatever reason or that you're thankful for, and we'll send it out for you.
Yeah.
And you saw it on Instagram and immediately sent it to me and said, "Let's do
How
this
is this
thing.
not something that we're involved in? Like,
why did we not come up with this? But we're not complaining.
Doesn't matter. Yeah. We'll just get in it. And
we just never thought. And so you were like, okay, I'm gonna figure out a different person in our city, either government or a principal of a school or a business owner or whatever, new businesses. Over the years, we've written once a month to tons of different people.
Yeah, I added it up one time and it was a lot, and then I've lost that number.
My imagination for its effectiveness was really low.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a cool idea, great encouragement, whatever. It might not even get to them, because but the story started coming in. We started having, people show up to our church and they would mention one of the, you'd get calls. You weren't even at Thankful Thursday a lot.
No, I usually can't be there for, variety of reasons, but like, you and Erica run it and like, I'm getting all the calls, this is like one of the perks to the job. I take on, the responsibility for all the hard things that happen too. But I also get I get a lot of the news about all the cool
we don't
things
really hear much of what it does. But
unless
you
I
get
pass
calls,
it down. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You've gotten calls from a former city manager who I don't know, I think he just started weeping when he received thank you.
He was like, I'm ready to quit this job. And he stayed in it for probably another year. And he was like, a lot of it had to do with this flood of thank you notes I got from a bunch of people I've never met before in my life.
Yeah.
Same thing happened with a city clerk, and same thing happened with some other folks who've worked in our city. And then this last week we wrote to a new business that's opening up and just say, welcome to the Hood. We love you. We're glad you're here.
Let us know if we can help you.
How can we be on the same team?
Yeah, exactly.
And you get all those in the mail from a bunch of strangers, and it can kind of turn the tide. You know?
When was the last time you got an encouraging thank you note?
Yeah. It goes a long way. And honestly, cost to the person writing the note is negligible. It's almost nothing. To show up with a couple of other people.
3 sentences.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I guess maybe you spend a little bit on a cocktail you buy or whatever, whatever. But and it's
darn, you go get
30 minutes or an hour out of your time because you're in a conversation with someone around you. But gosh, it's almost nothing to the writer of the note, and it means the world to the person who's receiving it.
Yeah.
Gratitude and encouragement are sort of built into the way, following the way of Jesus. Why not take advantage of this thing this bar owner put together and turn it into a rhythm and a practice for our people that actually has a spiritual impact on both them and the recipient?
And now we're the only reason it's still going.
Yeah, exactly.
He has stopped advertising it or whatever, and we're the annoying ones who still show up and make him pay for postage to send 8 to 10 letters out. And if if we want to look different than the world, there's all this, we need to look different. So that's an excuse to not engage in certain worldly, quote unquote, things. Mm-hmm. But if we want to look different, who else is writing thank you notes to their and encouragement and investing in communities and being a non-anxious presence to steal from
Sayers,
Mark Sayers,
mm-hmm.
Who is choosing to do that and be those people in those spaces where it's usually hate, vitriol, anger, division, violence,
criticism. Yeah.
Everything except what Jesus has his people do.
Gentleness and gratitude and encouragement and celebration.
And
these
patience.
these are all characteristics of following the way of Jesus. And if these are the things that we are supposed to be that set us apart, then these are the things that we should be practicing, even if they aren't our idea. You know what I mean? I look at all the things that our church does, and very, very, very few of them are original ideas that we had.
Yeah.
We just beg, borrow, and steal all the time.
Right.
And we're really open about it, and people are great, please take this. That would be awesome. We've been able to be at the table a lot of times for the origination of the idea or the implementation of the idea. But we can take credit for very little that's happened in this community, and that I love that because it really does feel like our city, our parish, have come together to accomplish things together. I'm not getting any credit for this stuff individually.
Yeah.
We are doing this.
Don't be discouraged from something because a person who's not a Christian. In fact, let that catalyze you. Mm-hmm. To think of other opportunities in ways that you can impact your community. It's a prideful posture to mm-hmm. say that thing is good on its surface, but it wasn't started by someone who follows Jesus. Mm-hmm. So it's not worth our time. Why not? Why not take that thing, engage in it, encourage and make it something that people who follow Jesus actually do?
Absolutely.
Parish Podcast is a production of Vineworks Film Company. The executive producer is Nathan Hoag. This episode was produced, edited, and hosted by Canaan Hurst. Graphic design and set design by Erica Krysl. Find us on social media at Parish Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you listen. This video podcast has been made possible by the generous support of the Sacred Grace, an incubator and accelerator that's cultivating leaders to take spiritual and social responsibility for their neighbors and neighborhoods. For more information, visit thesacredgrace.com.